this is Christina M. Bowersmith, and welcome to my presentation for Practicum BLE 580. I go by Tina, and I am a single mom of 4 boys. We moved to Arizona a little over a year ago before COVID shut everything down. We were living in Washington by this beautiful waterfall. It was just about a mile down our street. And for some reason, we came back to the desert where we experienced one of the hottest summers on record last year. I think I will be a Pacific Northwest girl at heart for the rest of my life. However, I grew up in Massachusetts. I went to the University of Delaware where I studied art and psychology with the hopes of doing art therapy. After graduating, I did work with children and adults with behavioral and mental disabilities, as well as working with kids in a before and after school and camp care kind of work. I also have background in respite care. I moved to Arizona originally about 2 decades ago, and I got my post-bac for education K through 8 at Arizona State University, and I got my K through 8 certification. I worked for 7 years here in public schools before taking a decade off to raise my family. During that time, I spent time as a Sunday school teacher. I homeschooled my children for a little while. I was a tutor for other homeschooled children. I was an art docent at my kids' public school. And I worked at a preschool for a little while with students who spoke English, Mandarin, Korean, Mexican, and amongst other languages. My teaching experience, I have 7 years of teaching in public schools. My first 2 years I spent at Phoenix Elementary School District number 1 in a general ed 6th grade classroom with a population that was about 96% ELL and 98% Hispanic. So I was a minority at the school. The next 5 years I spent with Mesa Public School, and 4 of those years I spent in a school that was about 65% ELL students with a mix of students that were white, African American, Hispanic, and Native American. For 2 of the years, I was in an ELA inclusion classroom, team teaching and collaborating with the special education teachers, and then in a 6th grade classroom. And then the next 2 years, I spent in an 5-6 ELL only classroom. And then the last year, I moved schools within Mesa School District and spent a year in a 3rd grade classroom. I've worked with students ranging the gamut from new to the country, not speaking any English at all, to students who are proficient in English, students who tested out of the ELL program recently, and then students who are native English speakers. I am currently taking classes both here at ASU in this program, but also at the University of Southern New Hampshire, doing my coursework in language-based learning disabilities and dyslexic studies. And I am not currently teaching. So I wanted to do a project in which I connected the English language learners with my special education connection. I have a background in which in both school districts that I worked in, was on the child study team or teacher assistant team. Some schools, depending upon the district, it might be called RTI. And this is a committee in which teachers discuss interventions, help with monitoring students, and decide who might need to be referred for special education testing. As I said before, I worked for 2 years as an inclusion classroom teacher as well, collaborating with special education teachers. I also have experience in special education assessment process from a parent point of view, as 2 of my 4 children currently receive special education assistance, and I had to go through the whole process of them getting assessed and fight to make sure that they got the services that they needed. Um, I also did in a previous BLE class, I did a research paper on the overrepresentation of ELLs in special education. So what I wanted to do was I came up with a project of 4 different aspects that connects those two, my two studies. My first project is a teacher resource, and it is a presentation on the difficulties of assessing ELLs for special education. The second project is a pre-special ed assessment for ELL interventions form. The third project, I went for a parent resource pamphlet on English language learners versus language-based learning disabilities. And the fourth project is a student bio form for teachers. So my first project was a presentation on difficulties of assessing ELLs for special education services aimed at teachers. Currently in place, there's not a whole lot for people to learn about ELLs and special education. So through my research in my previous BLE class for my research paper, I found out that there's not a whole lot of information available to teachers or parents, and there's not a lot of professionals with both an ELL and special education background. So it's an underserved population. There tends to be a cultural bias in the assessments in general, but especially for special education for students who are ELL students. And there's an overrepresentation of ELLs in special education. What I wanted to do was I wanted a way to inform educators, both general ed and special ed, and even ELL teachers, about the difficulties in assessing ELL students for special education and the overrepresentation of ELLs in the special education program. So what they say is that once a student is referred, because of the cultural biases and the problems with the assessment, students often will test into special education if they're an ELL student, even if they don't need special education services. So the best way to prevent this overrepresentation is at the intervention stage, and making sure that ELL students are getting the language acquisition interventions that they need, and it's not being confused between a language-based learning disability and a language acquisition problem. So this presentation that I made is to be used with staff members, professional development, like a staff meeting or training. And I used a lot of different resources. I used some from our class, but mostly I used the resources that I gathered when I was doing my research in my previous BLE class, as well as information from my Southern New Hampshire University coursework. So what I did is I made a slideshow presentation of pertinent information for teachers to understand. And here I just have a Venn diagram of the difference between a student who is ELL and a student who has language-based learning disabilities. And as you can see in the middle, there are a lot of things that overlap. So this is why it becomes hard to decide if a student is struggling from language acquisition or a language-based learning disability, because they can look very similar in a lot of areas, such as they have spelling problems, delayed or no response to questions and directions, they're unable to decode words while reading, trouble with word problems in math, appearing easily distracted, unmotivated, or inattentive. They might need things repeated or broken down the steps of instruction, and they require longer wait time. Because of this, students are often misplaced in special education. So my slide presentation gives a bunch of information for teachers to understand this and to realize that they need to make sure that they are figuring out whether it is a language acquisition problem or they really do need to be referred for special education. And it encourages teachers to do more intervention with their students for language acquisition. The next project I came up with kind of pairs with this, and it is a pre-special ed assessment ELL intervention form. So currently the way things are, when a student is referred for special ed, it is a very long and cumbersome process. It can keep kids who really do need the services waiting for months, falling behind by even like half a year, and continuing to struggle while they are trying to decide if they even need to be tested for special ed. Teachers need to meet with a CST or TAT team or RTI in some schools. And this can go on for weeks and months as they continue to have meeting after meeting, coming to the meeting, being given interventions to try, going and trying the interventions for weeks, and then coming back to discuss it at the meeting. And so the other problem is that when teachers are unaware of what their students' proficiency level is in English, then we have the reverse, where instead of kids waiting forever to get the special education services that they need, we have students who don't need special education services being misplaced within special education services. And ELLs are disproportionately represented in the special education population due to the fact that they are often referred for special education before programs are appropriately modified to meet their needs. Also, culturally inappropriate assessment methods are often used when assessing for special education. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to have a form in which teachers begin filling out before they even start the TAT or RTI process. And the idea was to streamline the process and save time for those who actually need the services so they could get in sooner, and to prevent students who don't need the services from being tested and put into a program that they don't belong in, and for the teachers to instead become aware of their needs for English acquisition, language support. So the idea was for teachers to do their due diligence before attending their first meeting, and to have a form in which they would need to fill out before they even come to the first meeting. And then teachers could also start interventions and be keeping track of their interventions before coming to cut back on the amount of time that it takes. Also, I wanted to make teachers more aware of the language levels of students, because if you're in a school with a smaller number of ELLs, the likelihood that an student is going to be put in special ed is a lot higher. And so because the teacher doesn't realize and they don't have enough training on language acquisition. And so I used a lot of research sources, again, some from class like Bright and Samway, and then some that were new resources that from my prior research. So what I came up with was a form. And it is meant to be used. The first page is information that needs to be filled out before a teacher even gets to the TAT meeting. And it's basically information they're going to ask the student anyway, or the teacher anyway, about the student. So they're already prepared with that information. It asks teachers to look at, is there float on record? So that would be the first thing. Like, do you have an ELL child? Is your child learning English? And if so, what services are they receiving, if any? And then it asks things like, what is their proficiency level? Pre-emergent, emergent, basic, intermediate, proficient? What's their Zella score? Have they tested out of ELL services, and how long ago? Because we know that students need interventions for language acquisition even after they test out of ELL services. And then the next page is it says if they answered yes to any of the questions, it gives them a bunch of interventions that they can use for their ELL students, ranging from general, phonetic, and morphology problems, comprehension problems, and then struggling writing problems. And so they could be starting these interventions before they ever get to their first meeting even. And then it gives them, and then there's general interventions for ELL students, such as using graphic organizers, more hands-on learning, scaffolding, things that they might not be using enough with their students. And then there's a list of things to keep in mind about ELL students, like running records are not an accurate representation of ELL students' language ability. That ELLs often that they'll go through a silent period, and things for teachers to keep in mind. The next page where you see that triangle, that is the intervention tiers, and then it just gives some information to the teachers to consider and to be aware of. And then the first chart is asking teachers, what interventions, ELL interventions, are you currently using in your classroom? Because if they have an ELL student, they should be using them already. But again, you have some areas where there's not a lot of ELL students, and so teachers are unaware of this and not doing what they need to do. And it asks them for what the intervention is they're using, specifically talk about that intervention, how long have they been using it, and what are they seeing, if progress, if any. And then it gives, the next page is a place for them to fill out, and it says, please pick at least 3 ELL interventions you are not yet using in your classroom to try with this student, and record observations in progress below for at least 6 weeks. Please introduce only one intervention at a time and use it for 3 to 5 weeks before adding it to the next intervention. And the thing is they can be doing this before they even get to their first TAP meeting. They could have the appointment set up, and they could be starting these interventions, and then they could be progressing through them so that they could be getting a head start on the process of getting students referred. So then the next part I have is a parent resource pamphlet on ELLs and language-based learning disability. So right now what we currently have in place is pretty much nothing. There's very little information out there for parents. They don't seem to be aware of the process their students go through as they're acquiring a second language. There's not a lot of information out for parents to know about language-based learning disabilities. And oftentimes, parents, certain cultures will see things like needing special education as being shameful, and they don't want to talk about it, or they don't want to ask for their child to be tested for these things. So what I wanted to do was I wanted to give parents more information on this, because the more parents are informed, the more involved they are. And the more involved they are, the better that their child is going to do in school. And so the idea was to come up with a resource for parents that might be at parents' night, literacy night, parent-teacher conferences, any of those places. And it would basically be a way to open dialogue about language-based learning disabilities and language acquisition process without the stigma. And so the resources I did use some of our classroom resources such as Wright and Herrera. The Newhall that I used there, that language-based learning disabilities, that's one of my resources from my Southern New Hampshire University coursework. And then what I came up with was a pamphlet. And obviously this pamphlet's in English, but the idea would be to have this pamphlet be available in Spanish or whatever language might be the language being spoken at a school. And this pamphlet includes information on things like the proficiency level and what to expect of their student when they are going through the different proficiency levels as they learn a different language. It talks about some of the things like what they can do to help their student. Signs that their child might not be just struggling with English language acquisition, but also with a language-based learning disability, because there are ELL students who do have language-based learning disabilities. And so there's kind of a way to differentiate and have an idea of which one they might be struggling with so that they know to ask, hey, I think my kid needs to be looked at for special education. And then there's information about language-based learning disabilities to kind of get rid of that stigma and say, hey, listen, your child isn't stupid. That's not what the problem is. They need support. Usually language-based learning disability students have above average or average IQs, and normally they will have they will excel in other areas such as sports, music, science, math. They just need extra support in their language. And of course, it's going to be hard for them to develop English language skills if they have a hard time with just language-based learning in general. So the next part that I have is going back to a teacher resource, and it's a student bio form. And so for this one right now, usually what they have in place, it will vary by district, and it's usually like a double-sided form that you might get like a copy of at the beginning of the year that gives general information about your student, like who their parents are, their address, their phone number, test scores, maybe a picture from like their previous school year. And usually at the end of the year, you have to fill out things like what were their Zellas if they had them, what were their, state testing information, like what was their score, and then you might add their picture from this year. But it doesn't have a whole lot of personal information or anything that's really super useful for a teacher to get an understanding of their student. And so oftentimes what happens is teachers don't really get to know their students until they're like almost halfway through the school year, or at least through one quarter. And that is a whole quarter that they have just wasted of not knowing who their students were and trying to get to know them when they could be aiming what they're doing and how they're working with these students. They could be aiming that towards their students if they knew their students. And so my thought was, if we came up with a student bio form that teachers had their hands on from day one with these students, that gave more useful information to teachers, then they would know who their students are and how to serve them better. And they would know like things like, is their student ELL? Were they recently tested out? How long ago? Were they in the process of being referred to special ed last year? And now, they come in and you don't know that. They have to start the process all over again, but only after you realize, oh, hey, I think this child needs to be referred. Are they repeating a grade? Things like that. And I wanted this form to be something that had information that was permanent on it, but also information that's updated yearly and that would go across districts or be moved with them to the next state with their school records. So for resources, I used a lot of my resources that we've had in the classroom, like Write. Mostly I used the Herrera resource of the biography-driven instructions and the response to intervention, pre-instruction assessment. Those were two of the biggest ones. But then I also reached out to teachers that I know who are in teaching, have taught, anything like that, and asked them, like an impromptu survey, like, what would you like to know about your student when they first enter your classroom? What would be helpful information to know up front that takes you an entire quarter or semester to get to know, that might be good to know on day one when that student enters your classroom? And so what I came up with was, a bio form, and it's not just one form, it's like a bunch of forms. And so the idea was that the first 2 pages are basically permanent file information. This is information that is the same and doesn't seem to change, but so you fill it out, but then there might be places where you add on as time goes by. So things like the name, the date of birth, the sex of the child, that stuff's not going to change. What their home language is or where they were born, that stuff doesn't change. But it also has things like their gender pronoun, which might change. So the sex might be filled out and they might be a male and go by he, she, but as they progress in school, they might decide that's not the gender that they identify with, and they might want to be it, they, she, her, things like that. Then there's information on their health history, things like pregnancy issues, issues at birth, developmental milestones, things like that. That stuff's going to stay the same after it's filled out the first time. Ear infections, that might never get filled out. Or in 3rd grade, they might get an ear infection and the teacher might need to say that they had an ear infection that year. Major illnesses, infection, injuries, surgeries, medication, other pertinent information. And the point is like, if you have information on the pregnancy or issues at birth, that could be information that is helpful when trying to decide if a child needs special education services, and information that they would need during testing. For instance, I have a son who was born 9 weeks early. So that might be information that is helpful for his teacher to understand that, yes, he's 7 and in kindergarten, but he also is super tiny because he was a preemie. And there might be issues that pop up along the way. And then there's a place, of course, for the student's photo, and you could just add the photo on top of the most recent photo so you could look back. And then you have home history. So Things like where they were born, how many years they've been in the country, things like, or years they spent in a different country, things like that aren't going to change. Why they moved. Then it has questions on like, are they a refugee? Were they in transitional housing? Is there any history of exposure to war, violence, environmental weather tragedies, governmental or political strife, famine, homelessness? And then guardianship. Has there been a guardianship change? Is there a divorce? That might get filled out later on. Maybe that's left empty, and then in the 3rd grade their parents go through a divorce, and that's something you note on there that stays there. Were there any deaths in the household? Because that can affect kids. And any additional information about their living situation. And then the last part on there is the educational history. And again, this is stuff that's pretty much going to stay. Like, were they in schools outside the U.S.? Normally once a kid comes to the U.S., they don't return to the country that they came from, but they might. And so if they did 2 years in school in Mexico and then they immigrated to the U.S., then that information is going to be on there and it's going to stay, and that teacher will be able to see it. Were they retained? Is it an IEP, a float on record, things like that. So that's stuff that's all going to be pretty much stay the same, but if some of that information might need to be added as time goes on. Then the next section is to be filled out yearly. And this is information about things that could change throughout the year, but then you want to be able to stick into the file for the next year's teacher to be able to see so they can refer back. And in part of this bio form, there is an explanation that I have typed up and a rationale of why these things are asked. That's enclosed so that you could do, if they were to implement this at a district, they could do a staff meeting or staff training and say, explain it all to them, go through it with them, and then the teachers just, once they know it, they fill it out. So each year, they might have these 3 pages, and this is not meant to be extra work. It's meant to be helpful and have the information in one place for a teacher to be able to refer to and look at. And so the stuff that needs to be filled out is the basic information on the first page, like, their mailing address and who's going to be who's going to receive the information that goes home. So one of the things that teachers have said is it'd be helpful to know if mom and dad both live in the house. And if they don't, do mom and dad both receive emails and communications? Is dad not in the picture? Should dad not be mentioned? Do they live with grandparents? How do they get to school? One of my teacher friends said that she found out after the student had already dropped out from missing too much school that they had to take the bus to school, like the public bus, and they couldn't afford the bus pass. And she says, I would have bought him a bus pass if I'd known this, but he had already missed so many schools and dropped out that it was too late. Are there any custody issues? Things like that. So just the basic information on the first page, but then it gets into further information about things like, who lives with them in the house? Do they have siblings that are at that school or another school? Are there any allergies? Should they be wearing glasses? When was their last hearing and seeing screening? Because those are usually given within the school, so those need to be filled out yearly. Sometimes kids have glasses and they don't have them though. They don't wear them at school. They don't bring them, or they're broken. And if that's the case, maybe the teacher or the school psychologist or somebody at the school can help to find a way for the student to get their new glasses. I know the Lions Club in Phoenix used to do glasses for kids. Things like food allergies. Is there an EpiPen? I had a student that I went halfway through the year before I ever realized that he was a hemophiliac. I had a student that had diabetes that I didn't know until months into school. Are they on medications? That's important because if your student's on medication and they didn't take it in the morning, they might be off. And so teachers need to know these things. Then there's like sensory issues and sensitivities. A student might not be able to sit in the lunchroom because it might be sensory overload. They might need a quiet place to sit. Things like that are things that are going to affect how a student functions in a classroom. Physical disabilities. And then the next page is again, filled out yearly, and it's a parent-student feedback form where basically you're asking the students and the parents, and this is more for your own sake as a teacher. What is your favorite subject? What do you like best about school? What are your strengths? And it could be in school or outside of school. What areas do you need to work on? Again, could be in school, outside of school. It could be a subject, or it could be something like, I have a hard time paying attention. What are your special talents you have? And then things like you ask the parents, again, like, what would you like to see your child accomplish this year? What can I do as a teacher to help you support your child? Things like that. And so the point is not to be invasive and asking parents this information. The parent part of this could be done at, meet the teacher night, or in a conversation in the first month of school where you call and you ask them about these things. You could send it home. It also then, it is garnering parent interaction and parent involvement, because now you're reaching out to the parents and asking them, like, what do you want to see your student do? And you're having a conversation with them to get the information for these forms, so that there's a connection now, and the parent might be feeling more comfortable and more likely to reach out to you or to come in and get involved. And so it's not meant to, I know some of the information on here is stuff that you might not be able to specifically ask, but you could, if you are discussing things with the teacher, with the parent rather, kind of bring up and fish for to see if they give you any of this information. Some of the stuff might not get filled out because you might not get this information. But the point is the more you know about a student and the more information you have, the easier it will be to do your job to help that student and to know where their struggles are. What might be going on outside of home that's affecting how they are doing within school? Does your student need ELL support? Should your student be looked at for special ed? Does your student have, maybe it's not a behavioral issue you're seeing that's in school that's problematic, maybe it's something going on at home and you need to figure out a different way to approach it with your student, all sorts of things. So yeah, I'm particularly proud of my student bio form, but that's that. So that was my presentation. Thank you for listening. I know it was kind of long. I'm hoping that at some point some of this will be something that I can enact within my classroom or school, and that I can bring more awareness of that English language learner and special education language-based learning disability connection to others within the school system, whether it's teachers, parents, students, or faculty. Thank you for listening.